let me just start again. I'm just blanking out. Even it's evening for
It's
me.
evening for everybody. That's right.
Okay. Hello everyone, and welcome to this podcast channel. For this particular podcast, I have with us Dr. Matthew Lungren, who is the associate professor at Stanford University and also a co-director of the Stanford Center for Artificial Intelligence in Medical Imaging. And he has a very strong background in medical applications and use of AI for particular medical applications. And he's also he has a very strong undergrad background from Arizona State University, so definitely good levels over there. so. But I'll let him introduce himself, but I'll like to welcome you to the podcast, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is great. Yeah, in terms of my background, you're right. I actually grew up in the Phoenix area, went to Arizona State as an undergraduate. I actually pursued an English degree at Arizona State in addition to a biology degree, and then went off to medical school at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and then to Duke for my residency training in imaging and image-guided interventions. And then, now I'm a faculty here at Stanford. And my time is sort of split between my clinical duties, which is, about half of my time I'm seeing patients, performing procedures, reading imaging studies. And then the other half of my time, I'm co-director of the center, as you mentioned, which is a sort of a Stanford-wide initiative that now has more than 110 faculty across different departments and schools related to clinical machine learning. And then, whatever time I have left, I run a research lab just on my own research work with students and postdocs and PhD students. So it's a busy life, but it's great. Stanford's an awesome environment for particularly this kind of work right now, and it's just really nice to have a mix of traditional kind of clinical practice and also kind of trying to explore what's possible with these new technologies.
Wow, that sounds really awesome. Yeah, definitely. And talking more about machine learning and machine learning application to medical imaging, it's a very broad topic in itself, and we have seen a lot of breakthroughs in the very recent times. But to talk to more in detail, like what are your current focus and what specific area of medical imaging you try to apply machine learning to, and what are your current projects if you feel like talking about it, like how are you using machine learning right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually have applications from development, sort of kind of futuristic new ideas, all the way to relatively straightforward clinical trials and translation, right? So it really spans the gambit. I kind of started out with just sort of very early on what's possible kind of stuff, right? Just sort of seeing what we could do with some of these tools, and was consistently impressed with kind of the performance of some of the early work that we did, mainly with two-dimensional imaging like chest X-rays and things that are very common. It's actually the most common imaging exam in the world, right? And sort of thinking about low-hanging fruit, large population sort of use cases for that, and then kind of branched into, again, more advanced imaging modalities, CT and MR and other things. I think along the lines of directions, we really try to take very multidisciplinary teams, so domain experts in the clinical side and certainly domain experts in the computer science side, and try to team them up. And really, that's been a kind of a secret sauce for a lot of the success that we've had. And so, kind of, you can almost name any area of medical imaging, and there's a chance that we have a project or have done work in that area. But it's not just about us, so to speak, right? We're not just trying to promote just the work that we're doing. We really try to take the things that we're learning and open it up to the broader community, and that's really been a core belief, a core mission of ours. And so, in other words, we've really put an emphasis on leading the space of making more AI-ready data sets in medical imaging available to researchers all over the world. We recognize that, even with infinite time, we'll never come up with the kinds of ideas that, a kind of a crowdsourced, scaled community like the computer science community can. And, we learned from the experiences of ImageNet, right? Fei-Fei Li's groundbreaking work really did propel deep learning into the space that we're kind of all currently enjoying, right? And understanding what's possible. And I think having large amounts of labeled AI-ready data sets available really helps us all investigate and really, broadens engagement into the medical imaging space, which helps everybody, right? We learn just as much from other groups working on the data sets that we've sort of developed and put out there than practically we've learned on our own, right? And so that's really great, I think, and it's really helped, I think, elevate the visibility of this field. As we look towards the future, what I really pride myself on, at least personally, is that I really try to get in the weeds and learn as much as I can. I don't have a strong technical background. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a computer scientist, but I've again spent a lot of time asking the right questions, learning from my students, learning from some of the computer science professors here, and in that process, the folks that I work with also are learning about medicine. Right, that's a even potentially more difficult thing to learn about. There aren't a lot of online courses, right, for that kind of knowledge. And so when we put together these teams, I think there's a lot of cross-disciplinary learning, and so as I see sort of the future, or just as our projects kind of roll out, different pieces of that domain expertise become more important depending on where you are in that cycle. And so again, whether it's development of a cool idea or whether it's trying to design a clinical trial, you can't do it alone. You need to have a variety of domain experts, and that's kind of how we've focused our work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And to try to probe you more on the background, as you mentioned, you don't have a very technical background into the computer science aspect, but you still are one of the leading people that I personally, because most of my work around revolves around my medical imaging too. And I know I have come through across a lot of works within your students or lab or in general your vicinity of people. But can you recall the time that you first stumbled or babbled around machine learning, and you thought that machine learning has a very crucial impact into medical imaging? Because I'm sure maybe prior to 2012, not a lot of focus would have been onto using machine learning for medical imaging. It would have been a pure medical research community. So can you recall and share with us, like, what was the first time you understood that, hey, machine learning could be something really useful for pure medical research too?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I actually, it's funny, there's folks that come at this from like data science, some people come at it from biostatistics, some come from engineering, pure computer science. There's a lot of different avenues to get into this area. For me, my journey was obviously non-traditional in a lot of ways. I have an MPH, which is sort of really focused my attention on sort of large, public health sort of related projects. And for me, that required, again, this is in the 2013 range, to do that work, you need to acquire a lot of data. And with the kinds of work that we were working on, that it required a lot of manual annotation, right, and curation and data wrangling. And those are skill sets that are underappreciated. But for any project, you can ask anyone, no matter how much work they're doing, a good 80%, right, is the common thing they say, is literally just sorting out the data, right, before you could even get to machine learning. And so some of those skill sets I had acquired just from doing projects at sort of a population level. But really, when I came to Stanford, again, I hadn't been exposed to anything related to machine learning, but I had been looking for an avenue to do NLP, because a lot of what we were working on were large data sets of radiology images and reports. And if you know much about medical imaging, which sounds like you do, we don't have structured labels, right, for what's on the image, right? It's a free narrative text. And that poses lots of problems to scale and curate and, structure data sets. And so I was, previous to that, I had done it manually, which is obviously not ideal. And then sort of getting to know some of the resources here, reaching out, and, again, we're really fortunate here at Stanford. My office is in the medical school. I'm literally like 4 blocks from the Gates building, right? So it takes me 15 minutes to walk over to where it all started. A lot of the big computer science luminaries, sort of got their education. So I was able to kind of interact with that community really early on, say, hey, I've got this really big data set. I'm really working on this automation. And then, I just started to become real curious. I mean, I really felt like a light bulb clicked on for me. The more I learned about it, the more potential I saw. And again, I'm not alone. I think a lot of people felt the same way. And it just happened that we had the right combination of, I had been really experienced with gathering large data sets, trying to draw conclusions already from a population level, and then sort of saying, now we can automate this in all kinds of different ways, including on the pixel data, including on the text data. But if you look at some of my early work, I mean, it's more traditional support vector machines, right? LSTMs, us, just trying to look at just the text reports before I really moved into the pixel work. And I think that foundation actually helped me a lot because that's in my opinion, much more difficult conceptually to grasp a lot of the word embeddings and try to, really wrap my head around how this stuff really works. And it allowed me sort of to continue to evolve. And listen, I spend up to an hour and a half a day just dedicated to trying to read, trying to understand, asking a lot of questions on Slack and email with my colleagues. And over time, I've kind of gotten a casual education in this. And I think that from the perspective of my background, I look at this and say, a lot of clinicians are coming to me and saying, "Hey, how do I get started? I don't know how to code. I don't know. I don't have a strong mathematical background or something like that." And I sort of sort of say, there's a lot of analogies to how I've built my career to how we've been training imagers. So any radiologist is an absolute expert in imaging. They know when to use the imaging tools. They know how to use them. They know when they work, when they don't work, the principles. But most radiologists, 99.9% of them, have no idea how to build an MRI machine or build a CT scanner from scratch. That's not part of the work that we do, but we understand the principles, even the physical principles behind the work. It's very similar to me, what we do here, which is to say, I can sort of put together a conceptual roadmap. I can think about new computer science innovation that's happening in autonomous driving or other areas of computer vision. I can bring that back from my understanding of the principles and my own domain expertise to plan out how I might leverage that sort of innovation in the medical space. And so that, again, that doesn't require me to sit down with you and write out the proofs of the loss function, but I can at least sit there and tell you what I think we need to do to get there. And that's really, I guess, my journey. And so as part of that, we've said, hey, if I can do it, anybody should be able to do this. So we really tried to, I worked with another computer scientist faculty, Serena Young, to put together a course really focused on folks that don't have a technical background, aren't planning on coding, but do want to lead these projects, do want to understand more about it. We built a curriculum initially here, and then we ended up releasing it on Coursera. And for us, that really was kind of the least you need to know to get off the ground. And we hope that that's going to be sort of the nidus for other people to say, hey, this is super cool. I'm starting to get it. And then they get passionate about it. But my journey was certainly casual, but I've tried to, I don't know, build on my learnings and maybe make it more available to others as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I know about that course, so I'll definitely put a link to this particular course in the description. But yeah, it sounds really great, and it's definitely a very nice way that you caught up onto machine learning. Is like you didn't directly jump into deep learning, because a lot of people who are not from computer science domain but still work with machine learning, when they jump to deep learning directly, they like the concepts are much more weaker in general. They don't understand what are the consequences of using machine learning in a very bad sense, and in that case you have a very long but still a very concrete journey into machine learning. But yeah, you definitely did mention about something about self-driving and all those things. So if we take a step back and just eliminate right now just medical imaging, and if we see application of deep learnings in other applications, for example, like you said, self-driving or stock market prices and all those domains, we see a common thread that says that deep learning is majorly used for automating stuff and eliminating human errors. So as a medical professional, my question would be, how do you see machine learning playing a role to contributing to pure medical research? Is it something as innovative as, say, biomarker discovery? I have seen few papers where deep learning is like doing some marvelous stuff that even medical professionals were kind of shocked or wondered at. Or is it something just like for confirming your hypothesis, like you would hypothesize that, okay, this would be the thing, and you run it across all the data sets and you are just confirming your hypothesis? Or is it just as simple as just a tool to manage your data, or like you said, initial days, like sorting the data and making clean data sets? So where do you see machine learning fitting into the space of medical imaging right now, or maybe in the let's say next 5 years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, I think every use case you brought up, from, discovery, right? So looking at data in a new way to try to draw new insights based on maybe a clinical outcome, or, you mentioned the drug use case. So how can we, sift through, basically inhuman amounts of information to really sort it out and, narrow down on certain, candidates that would be useful to kind of, inform our next steps for trials and things like that. But also to just how do we gain new insights into the pixel data that we already have? How do we combine two different types of data sets, sometimes three, right? Different modalities, bringing them together. And then, but for me, I think as I look at the roadmap for, this work in medical imaging, I think the initial the initial models that we're seeing kind of deployed already, that are most likely going to gain traction for a long period of time are really just around the image reconstruction. So, that's kind of already kind of a machine learning ish thing. We do iterative reconstruction, filter back projection. These are mathematical sort of, very much a standardized way of doing things from, again, if you're familiar with medical imaging, you're kind of pulling things out of Fourier transforms or K-space, and you're creating an image that we can actually see and recognize as humans and interpret. There's a lot of work saying we can shorten some of those traditional kind of computer programming, right, approaches, and use deep learning to make it more efficient or faster. And I think that those things are already kind of baked into our next year or 2 or 3 years down the road. And so that's the image creation side, which again is much more of a almost a physics related or mechanical part of where this can have a lot of applications. And then you sort of go now into the clinical space and you say, how can I either take radiology, the work that we do, right, and sort of looking at different imaging studies, and how do I make that more efficient or quicker or more accurate, as you pointed out. And I think finding use cases where there's enough clinical benefit to be worth the effort in implementing into the system, and frankly dealing with the potential repercussions of this automated component within a relatively chaotic environment that has very high stakes, right? This is certainly not cat and dog photos. There's some major things on the line, and so we have to be very cautious about where we put these things. So we can develop hundreds of models that can do all kinds of different things, but then there's this step of, do we take that leap and go through the work of clinical trials, actually having it impact patients in a real way? And those decisions actually require a lot more thought around, again, the use case, the medical environment, the stakeholders, the patients themselves, and so those aren't quite the same as some of the other, again, the reconstruction kind of use cases and things like that. But even if you took a step further and said, well, how about we can use some of these models to do population level health, which again is something I'm interested in. Now you're saying, maybe this isn't part of the normal work that radiologists do, but maybe I can sort of take a large healthcare system and design a model that can identify patients who otherwise maybe wouldn't have been identified, that are at risk for stroke or at risk for heart disease or early cancer detection. And can I use that to sort of find ways to funnel them into healthcare workflows that already exist, and actually have better outcomes from that perspective? So it's not all about just how can I make a radiologist faster. It's a multifaceted sort of series of options that we have, and again, we try to take the ones that are obviously very robust, very well tested, but then do they provide what we call the utility? Is really what we end up. This is all a utility judgment. What are we getting out of it? What's the risk that we're putting into it? And do those things line up in a way that makes sense for our patients?
Hmm. Right, that makes sense, and that, like, this wasn't a part of my question list, but this brings me to a question: is how do you decide between, for example, given any kind of medical research you are doing for which you have data, how do you go on deciding, is this a pure medical research problem, or versus something that I should be using a statistical machine learning tool, versus should I be using a deep learning tool? What are the factors that in the past or in current you have considered that, hey, this is not something machine learning can do, like this is just something we as medical professionals should be able to solve, versus relying on machine learning?
Well, yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. I mean, you see a lot. Listen, there's everyone who's in healthcare who knows anything about, deep learning or machine learning at all, or have heard some things about it, has an idea, right? They're like, hey, I think I can do this, right? And so, we spend a lot of time actually as a center. We actually even have a program called the Office Hours program where it's open call. Anybody who's affiliated with our center can schedule time to sit down with a computer scientist or a domain expert, depending on their needs, and talk through the project that they have in mind before they start to do all that effort of collecting data, right? That painful work of getting the project set up. So I think sort of looking at it from a multidimensional domain experts, right, perspective first, and really thinking about the downstream. Okay, so if you can build this, what would you do with it? Who would be benefited? What would be the risks of that? But in terms of your comment about, can we just use simple? Does everything have to be deep learning? Of course, right? So like, we always try simple off the shelf things, and especially when we work with EHR data, which is obviously that relatively high dimensional but low n. You don't need some of these, like, 21 80 layer machine learning models. You could actually just get away with some simple regression and even other approaches, and achieve the same thing. And in that case, then it's much more explainable, right? I mean, we know that, and that's really the trade-off. Is the deeper you go, the more complex you get, the less explainable things become. And maybe your use case doesn't require that explainability, but trust is the currency of healthcare, right? You must trust your provider. You must trust, your healthcare system. And so to have some aspect of that care that's not explainable, making decisions for your body, your health, it's a bit of a difficult sort of conversation. So we really do sort of try to focus on, number one, utility. Can we get away with some simple models to sort of help make decisions around the use case? But then, again, if we are going into the deep learning space, and again, that's really where you're saying, okay, you can't really use regression for pixel-based analysis, at least to the level that we would need, right? So you do, encounter a lot of medical imaging where you do end up jumping into deep learning, and it does work quite well for certain cases. But how do you then say, is this going to actually really help us? Could this cause more problems than it solves? Those are the things that end up coming up later.
Hmm. Yeah, you actually mentioned two of the key terms that my next question was something trust and explainability. So I know this would be the answer to the question, but I still want to ask this question: is from a medical standpoint, if you were to complain about machine learning community, if just I had this particular XYZ thing, the application of machine learning on medical data sets could be much more smooth and better. What would be that thing that you could complain about, that hey, machine learning seriously sucks at this, and please fix this, or please do concrete research on something along those lines? What, according to you, would be two or three points that you would add to that?
Yeah, I think that we've talked about this a lot, and sort of thinking about, where do humans do their thing really well, and where do machine learning models do their thing really well, and can we find a middle ground to help us triage what would be a good use case? I think humans are incredibly good at transfer learning. So like that task of, I've seen a fracture on an X-ray, and then I maybe have never seen a fracture on a CT scan, a totally different modality, but I would only need to see one example and say, okay, that's also a fracture, right? That's not too hard. But that's not always the case with, as you know, with machine learning. You need to acquire thousands of examples sometimes, right? Annotate in a certain way, and then kind of do the same kind of thing. So that ability to sort of conceptualize knowledge and move it around, and think about almost metaphorically, if I'm calling on some of my English major sort of background, to say this is a creative endeavor. We're creative beings. That is a superpower that humans have. And I think it's underappreciated when we kind of boil things down to networks and trainings and outputs. Another thing that I think is to go on the machine learning side and say, what are they really good at? This is something that I would put in the bucket of quantification. We're terrible at quantification. Measuring, looking at the big picture and kind of summing things up, we can probably do well, but we can't really do that quantification and consistently, just as we could maybe with these machine learning models. So when I think about how, for example, a new drug would be approved for use, maybe it's based on an imaging outcome. So maybe a tumor is shrinking by a certain percentage over time on a drug. Well, that's based on human measurements over time, and there's error in there. There's error that could go one way or the other, and in aggregate could potentially cause the difference between an approval or a not, right? Or someone being kicked off a trial or kept on. That's something that I would almost argue that we should try to standardize, try to automate, and where machine learning would potentially have an advantage in that case. For me though, when I look at any of these given problems, trust and explainability are incredibly important initially. In other words, we want to know that the model is safe, effective, where it works, where it doesn't, and we want to be able to open it up and kind of look at it. But I sort of push back on the narrative that you need to have explainability for every use case. In other words, if I know that it's worked, I've built out a paradigm in which I can safely deploy this and I can test it. I don't need to, on every single case it examines, be able to explain that, right? So I think there's interpretability and there's explainability. I think for me, it's understanding that I have done the due diligence for the model in particular. And for a moment, I'll ignore kind of technical drift and distribution shifts and all those things, and just say, if we have this theoretical model that works and is safe, and I can explain why, where the guardrails are, I would feel comfortable deploying that without having to go those extra steps, saying, well, every case that it's looked at, I need to know why it made that decision. So that's one difference. But broad in speaking in broad strokes, again, there are things that humans are great at. There's things that models are great at. And one thing we have to be careful is as we bring the human strengths to the table and the model strengths at the same time, there's another interaction that happens there. And I think sometimes that has been ignored as well, which is around automation bias and some of the interface. So we find that we can have the exact same model, but we can present it in different ways to a human, and it will actually change the human's performance, even if we don't change the model. That's a critical insight, because we are just subject to just biases as humans. And automation bias is incredibly well documented and very seductive, right? We could sort of say, well, it's a computer, it must be right. I'm just going to sort of ignore my own judgment. We always use the GPS analogy where, if your GPS is just telling you to turn right, we just turn right. We don't really give it another thought. And so this is where we bring in some of the ideas about probability and say, can we provide the information that would also give an indication of the model's confidence? And then we can make a better judgment as humans when we're interacting with these models and say, well, now if your GPS said turn right here, I'm 50% sure. You're going to say, hold on a second. If you're only 50% sure, I'm going to look at my map, or I'm going to look around me and say, where am I, right? And so these are new areas, right? We haven't had so much interaction with machines as we do now, and we're learning about how these behavioral components play into our performance on the ground.
Wow, I really like the GPS analogy, because this is really useful. But again, I always wanted to probe someone as a medical professional on this particular thing. Is you mentioned explainability, so which is something that you want to understand on a subject basis. If a patient is particularly diagnosed for either healthy or non-healthy classes, you would just like to know why that particular patient suffered or not. But I have read a lot of literature on the interpretability, and one thing that all of the papers say, it's very subject to the matter. Like, it depends who's interacting with the model. Is it a professional? Is it patient? So it's a very open topic, subjective topic. But if I were to just ask you, because you are a person, an expert in medical imaging, let's say I just have your medical imaging data of patients. That is the only data that I have. I don't have the demographics and all those things. This is a hypothetical scenario. Please don't pick on me if that's not the case. But if I'm just dealing with neuroimaging data, and so the ideally of if I were to ask you, why did you classify that particular patient as a non-healthy one, you would just point out to me in the image, but you will also give a lot of background information based on your textbook knowledge that you have learned. But from a deep learning model, just based on neuroimaging data, how would you expect? I have seen for some works where they have attention maps, and I guess it was maybe you were a part of that research, was the chestnut or chestxnet or something. I don't know if I'm spelling that research correctly or not, but I have seen some of the work where they have attention maps, but a lot of people have criticized that is not the only thing that calls for explainability. So just to rephrase the question, just for medical imaging and neuroimaging data, how would you visualize or at least demand a machine learning community to look at explainability, and how would it look like to you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you know, as you mentioned in the beginning, it does depend on the particular use case. So, you know, if this is a decision as to whether I should be treated for a certain disease or not, you're going to want more information, right, about how that decision was made. And we have to be careful to think about. I think in the computer science sort of mindset, we're thinking, okay, this is a static doable problem. This is a single image. You know, this is what it is, and the previous data will always inform future data, and that is a huge misconception for what healthcare actually is. And I love this analogy that we're able to have now. I mean, again, we're sitting in the middle of a horrible pandemic that has basically been a microcosm of the pitfalls of leveraging prior data to make future decisions. In other words, if I had built a prediction model on outcomes of COVID in March or April, and I try to deploy that now in January of 2021, it's going to say a lot of wrong things, right? It's going to make a lot of bad decisions because treatment has changed. The demographics of people have changed. There's a vaccine. There's new therapeutics. Our understanding of how to treat these patients has changed. Well, that's a very compressed, dense example of all of healthcare, right? We change therapies often in many different diseases, right? We have lots of different approaches. So for me, where I think we're starting to awaken to the concept of the single pixel image, as we're just trying to look at the imaging task, that's not all the information there is to know. And if you rely on that as being that is the only problem, the only data source, I feel like we are going to ultimately do a disservice, particularly for diagnostic tasks, probably more so for prediction tasks. But if I'm looking at just pixel data, I'm totally ignoring tons of other useful information, right? And so that's where we've really tried to push hard, especially in the last couple of years, on multimodal data fusion, where we're now, okay, well, I'm going to show you the pixels, but I'm also going to give you contextual data. I may also give you prior imaging data, and I'll be able to sort of fill in some of the gaps that allow you to properly place that patient or that situation in if we're trying to imagine let's say an embedding space, a multidimensional feature space, you know, that change over time is actually more, it's easier to define and to avoid some of the pitfalls. So, you know, again, maybe you're saying this little opacity on an X-ray, that's got to be pneumonia. Well, is it pneumonia though? Because now I have this other data that might suggest that they have no clinical signs of infection. Maybe it's a tumor, or maybe it's edema, or maybe it's, you know, something else. And so, you know, that to me is really going to be our way forward. And this isn't rocket science to a medical clinician. You know, you look at you ask someone how to explain how they made a diagnosis, and just like you said, they're going to give you a whole lot of context. We can't expect a model to do the same thing if all it's given is pixel data. That's an unfair comparison. So if you're planning to use these systems in some future state, 10 years, 20 years from now, as an automated, you know, completely automated system, then it needs to be able to understand contextual data and, to my point about sort of the changing of time, also be able to continually update, right? I often use this example for our students, but, you know, Netflix updates thousands of times a day their model for deciding which movie you might like. Now, that's not a very important problem in my life, although I do like being able to know which movie to like. Imagine now that you're telling me for my healthcare, this model was trained 5 years ago and I'm still using it. That's ridiculous, right? So how is it continually learning from new data and new information? That's a challenge that our healthcare system is actually grappling with right now, how to understand the use of these models and, again, take advantage of one of their biggest strengths, which is the ability to continually update and learn, right? And why can't we borrow some of the learnings from other industries and say, you know, we can update this model and really fine tune it for the task at hand and the data that we have?
Yeah, what you said totally makes sense because even when I see the latest papers in trying to classify or predict a particular disease, I see a lot of multimodal deep learning models, which are not really effective or maybe better than the previous models, but they are trying to make an effort to do that. So yeah, that definitely makes sense. But trying to take a step back from interpretability, because I guess that's a much more of a subjective topic, is talking about the generalizability of models. I have seen, because I work at least on three projects, which are three different disorders, at least two different disorders, I would say. For now, it's the Alzheimer's and the post-traumatic headaches. And one thing that when I read papers and try to see what other people have done is, different institutions have different kind of data, different kind of models, and one model wouldn't definitely work on the other. And they have very highly explicit data, which is completely known to their own institutions. So me like me or a person like me as a young researcher, it really handicaps me to understand what exactly should I do versus I don't know what the data look like. But versus if I see on open computer vision problems, the data set is much more public. So like a cat image, I can just download it from the online, and I can actually see working it on my laptop, and hence I learn those things. So do you like you have a much more wide exposure to medical imaging and machine learning? Do you see the same problem? Like, do you face a similar challenge, I would say, in your research? Or, and if you do you think this problem can be solved? Because I know there are a lot of concerns and privacy issues, and that generates the whole problem in the first place. Or do you think researchers should have to find a way around these things, because it really limits the data sets in the first place is very small, and secondly they are very explicit. So can you comment more on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was thinking as you talked, whenever I hear someone's working on things like Alzheimer's or post traumatic headaches, that's tough, right? That's tough for healthcare in general. Like you can't, I don't know if you can get people in a room and have them agree and be consistent on those kinds of diagnoses. And if you're trying to use ICD code data, which is already known to be 30% ish wrong already, billing data, right? Then the fact that it's not really time stamped in a way that's useful for your clinical problem, and then adding in that those two diagnoses are very much clinical and sort of very subjective, right? You're really adding a lot of layers of difficulty for a machine learning problem, because again, you need a ground truth. Like I don't need to biopsy a cat. I can know it's a cat, it's what it is. But for Alzheimer's, I mean, what if they come out in 2 months with another biomarker or another consensus that says there's a new scoring system that you have to use? Are you going to have to go back and retrain all of your data? These are tough problems to tackle. It's not that they're not worth tackling. It's just that they're very difficult. And so to do that, I think you need to really understand what the task is that you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to predict a future diagnosis of cognitive disease or whatever? Can you get enough information to say no matter where the future moves towards, I can actually give a probability this person should undergo additional testing or something? So you have to reframe it. And you'll notice that in a lot of the work that I've done, I've tried to stick to use cases that the imaging modality tends to be where the answer is. In other words, I don't spend a lot of time, for example, another example might be prostate cancer, for example. It's an important problem, certainly, and there's a lot of different ways to tackle this. But, again, you have to do a biopsy, and the biopsy can be subjective, and there could be disagreement between the pathologists. So now you have a layer of disagreement on the imaging, a layer of disagreement on the biopsy itself and the read of that. So not that it's not worth tackling, but when I look at the low-hanging fruit, I'm looking at something like pulmonary embolism, right? Where you do a CT scan, that's it. You don't need to biopsy. There's either a clot there or there's not, right? Or there's a pneumothorax or there's not. These kinds of things for me set me up for success. In other words, I don't need to rely on incomplete billing data or a sort of a consensus of experts to really help me define my supervised learning problem. On the other hand, you can take a disease that is still difficult to define. There have been use cases where we've used unsupervised learning, as I'm sure you've seen, to take a well curated data set and try to draw insights into outcomes, and then use that to sort of make better decisions about how to come up with a diagnosis. And that's part of the discussion. And I think that that's a valuable approach too. But as you mentioned, if your data set's small, that's also kind of a difficult task. You're going to be so overfit to your own small population. So, again, when we go take a step back and say, is this really about generalizability? Well, sort of. I mean, if your model works well on your own data with your experts, but doesn't work, at another institution with their experts, is that a labeling problem or is that a machine learning problem? That's, I would almost argue that you're kind of encountering the noise of the labeling task or the diagnosis task more than you are a problem with the machine learning task. And so, but on the other hand, if it truly is that you've overfit and you need to be able to generalize, maybe it's across different types of scanners, different kinds of biomarkers, whatever else you're looking at. Well, then you do need to collect multi-institutional, multi-center, large population data sets that again, we've had this conversation before where maybe I'm really sure about my label and I'm really sure about my performance, but it still isn't generalizing. Well, that's because they use a different scanner or their population is, completely skewed in terms of a different ethnicity or a different gender. And that actually is shown to be a problem, right? So, and that's why when we focus on these large data challenges, if you look at the RSNA challenges that, we've helped try to put these together, we come up with problems like brain hemorrhage. You don't biopsy a brain hemorrhage. You know that that's hemorrhage on a CT scan. But even if you do have a great label, you don't want to have a problem where you're overfitting or you're causing generalizability problems. So we collected data from 4 countries, 4 institutions, and really now you can see that the models that are created from that data set, they actually generalize quite well because, again, a lot of those other difficult to control variables are taken into account when the model is created. So again, my hat's off to you because, I know that there's a lot of work in Alzheimer's and a lot of it's regarding, some biomarkers that are thought to be useful. There's multimodal, data work actually that was mostly pioneered in Alzheimer's because of the challenges of looking at just the pixel data, right? I understand that. At the same time, if I can't get, 3 or 4 experts in a room to agree, I'm going to start to wonder, hey, hold on a second, is this really the right time to start tackling this problem? Just like with COVID, using that example again, if I can't get 3 experts to agree how to treat COVID or whether, what it does in the body in March, I'm going to say, well, I don't want to do any prediction work yet because I know that things are probably going to change in 3 months, right? So I guess that makes me more of an opportunist looking at the low-hanging fruit. But these are discussions we have all the time because you can pick almost anything in healthcare and try to tackle it, right? And the question is just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, that is one thing I learned because I started maybe back in summer 2020 when I started my PhD study over here. And initially, because I am a computer science student, so for me, if I'm given a task, my first step is to just code it out and get the results and just develop a model. So I was given this very nice data set that was highly registered, and I worked on it and I saw the results, but the results weren't good. And I said, I got the best model. Why isn't it replicating its results? And it took me a very long time. And when I say long time, it was maybe at least 2 months to understand what I'm actually trying to do, because it was really hard for me to get the communication with the experts because I was working with few of the big name experts at Mayo Clinic. So it's very silly to ask questions like, oh, how do you classify this particular patient to be an Alzheimer's versus a healthy? So I was just too scared. So yes, I totally agree. And the complexity added when I read few papers, few articles, few blogs, and versus whom the advisor I work with as a computer science faculty, and everything just went in different directions. And I was like, if I don't know what I'm doing, how do I expect my machine learning model to get the accuracy values for you? So I totally agree. That is one thing I always bow down to medical professionals. Like I didn't have a much more exposure to those things, but now I do, and I see the challenge.
Well, you should feel totally. I mean, again, I always tell this to our students. I mean, if there's no such. I mean, I ask dumb questions all the time. When especially to folks that like who knows more about deep learning than Andrew Ng. I don't know if anybody really does. I'm totally willing to ask him a stupid question. I don't. I really have let go of any sense of I don't care if you think I don't know something because that's the truth. I don't know it and I want to know it. And as long as I'm so, again, I encourage the students, especially for some of our difficult machine learning problems that are kind of specialized, right? Specialized clinical problems. I say get in the clinic. I mean, obviously pre-pandemic, we would have our students hanging out in the clinic with the physicians. And I said, limit yourself to 10 dumb questions a day just so you don't annoy anybody. But, but ask those questions and observe and write notes and think about what they're doing, and, come back and then maybe read some literature and then come back with questions. We love that. I think everybody inherently loves to talk about the work that they're passionate about. And, again, you should never feel intimidated to ask questions about, because you have a genuine interest in helping solve healthcare problems that would benefit patients, right? So, we all have a best interest in mind, but it does require us to let down our guard. And, for me, as a quote expert, I don't consider myself in that light. I still am willing to come to this and say, I'm a beginner. Teach me what you know. And so I don't make assumptions before walking into the conversation that would prevent me from seeing the true insight. Again, I haven't mastered that. But the more gray hair I get, the more I realize that the beginner's mind is actually the one that wins the day.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I'll definitely take that suggestion. That actually sounds really nice. Like going to the clinic and actually seeing how this is done in practice really helps. Like at least for a motivation for a new architecture in deep learning, you never know. So I'll definitely take that suggestion. And talking about like asking dumb questions, what do you think are some of the most underestimated versus overestimated applications of deep learning in medical imaging? I know a lot of news media articles, just for the clickbaits, they would have these very big name titles. They would say like, oh, like it's taking over, the jobs of radiologists are going down. Those are some of the overestimated claims, versus like what are some of the underestimated claims that you think that people should be focusing more efforts, because it's a great potential for getting it out there. What would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that it's sad to see that I feel like a completely underutilized resource is using NLP and text-based analysis to try to acquire large labeled data sets. I think that part of that, actually, to be honest with you, is the difficulty in sharing free text. It's very difficult to de-identify that to the degree that we can pixel data. So there isn't as much in the community. Like, so for example, my hat's off to Mimic and the MIT folks who, they not only did they release chest x-rays with the labeling schema that we had for Chexpert, so now there's a little more than a 500,000 chest x-rays out there, which is great. Also with those same 14 labels, but then they were able to later release the text reports that went along with those chest x-rays. And I think that's such an underutilized resource, again, partially because it's not very freely available. But, again, relying on substandard NLP to then build projects and perform experiments with the assumption that these labels are just as good as ImageNet labels, that's a huge misconception that I hope that we can continue to sort of make clear. Now, we've shown that even really noisy labels like the initial NIH data set with chest x-rays, which had up to 30% noise in some of the labels, that still can develop models that work, right? It's tolerant of noise. We know that if you have a very clean test set. The problem is that a lot of folks don't have very clean test sets. They're just holding out a noisy labeled test set from the noisy training data, and that's not going to get the job done. You're not going to have something that you're going to understand the true performance, right? So, again, focusing on ways to scale, but really, again, transformers have really made this almost a foregone conclusion that we can do a lot of this work now. I think that architecture, that schema, and some of the newer, approaches that are coming out, we're not far away from being really good at text and pixel data together. But again, I think extracting the labels in a way that doesn't require a poor radiologist to go through hundreds of thousands of examples, or force the computer scientists to deal with the really noisy labels. I think that that's an underappreciated part of the work. And again, we all want to do the cool, sexy, pixel-based analyses, but a lot of that work is, as we kind of started out with, is actually creating the data sets, making them accurate, and having the right labels. And I guess to your point of just saying, what's the hype in all of this? In a controlled place, just like with your work, you can take a given data set that's really clean and outperform a human, or at least perform as I mean, that's a legitimate statement. But the problem is the real world is not clean. And it's not, and healthcare is incredibly messy. And so when you try to do a real world deployment of that, then you start to encounter all of the problems that our current research is trying to solve: multimodal input, comparing across priors with Siamese neural networks, looking at the difference in embedding space between two imaging examinations, and then bringing in clinical context, large data sets, right? Those kinds of things are meant to solve all of the drawbacks that occur when you go from hype saying, oh, well, look at what we did, to why isn't this now working in my clinic? There's that translation gap, aside from all the infrastructure and all the technical challenges, is also just, the lab environment, just like with drug development, just like with, how many times have we heard a cancer cure is on the horizon? We've cured mouse cancer like 500 times, but we haven't cured human cancer, right? So like there's a reason for that, right? The controlled experiment is not the real world. And so we have to recognize that this lag is not failure. This lag is just continued learning as to what works and what doesn't. And that's how we've approached it.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's a step by step process. So like these little steps actually count towards a bigger achievement. But talking like this was one of my favorite questions when I listed out all the questions. Was in your experience of using AI for medical purposes, has there been any, or regardless of even if it's not your own work, have you come across any work that was something like before application of AI, it used to have some challenges, but after using AI tools, it produced substantially really good results, or at least insightful results. Have you come across any kind of those challenges? And just to give a nice preface to that, is I always like this one short story by Rich Caruana. He's a researcher at Microsoft Research, and he shared in one of the conferences where he said like this was back few years back, where he used the neural network model when it wasn't so cool, but a part of his PhD thesis he worked on pneumonia data, and he was trying to build a classifier for patients. And the conclusion of that particular neural network was patients who had asthma are safe of pneumonia. And when he went to the medical professionals, they said like, never say those things out, they are completely false from a medical standpoint. But the results were on mark. And I don't know if you have heard this article or not.
Yeah, we used that example in our course, actually,
Oh.
because what happened, I don't know if you know the story behind that, but what they actually did was they used data from a healthcare system that had a very specific protocol. And the protocol said that if someone had pneumonia and they had asthma, they needed to be admitted and treated aggressively. Whereas if you didn't have that, then you weren't given that aggressive treatment. And so patients with asthma that ended up having pneumonia and diagnosed in that system got aggressive treatment and actually did better because they got aggressive treatment than the regular folks that didn't have asthma history. So when you look at the data, you're like, well, geez, asthma is a protective factor, right? That's not medically, that makes no sense. So you have to look at how the data was created. And there's a lot of pitfalls like that with EHR data. And these are examples we use in our course to really try to explain, you can have a result, but if you can't ask the right questions about how that data was trained, what it was, how it was used and how it was curated, I guess, you could potentially cause a lot of problems. Again, we like to say you can have one bad clinician who can impact the healthcare of, a few thousand patients. Again, not that that's small, but compare that to a bad model that can be, scaled across an entire healthcare system and impact hundreds of thousands, millions of patients. That to me is the reason why we have to be so incredibly careful with our machine learning use cases, because again, the possibility of scale.
Yeah, definitely. But like, yeah, that's a very different view to look at it. But me as a student, or maybe a naive researcher, what I looked at the story, it looked like the neural network model gave some very nice insights. Like at least the part that you said, like people who had asthma would be going through severe healthcare treatments, and hence they wouldn't contract pneumonia or something like that. To me, as a ECS researcher, it felt like it was an insightful thing that anyone would have been benefited to know. In your experience, have you come across like at least any kind of pure such cases where you saw AI giving some insights that wasn't like, it wasn't something new knowledge, but at least like pattern finding that was very insightful to a medical professional?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll tell you that, I think in the domain of, so one of the domains I think that is the least well understood and explored and is subject to the limitations of human ability is pathology, right? So, yeah, a medical image, I can look at a chest X-ray in 20 seconds and really kind of do I can look at all the information on that. But a slide is hundreds of times larger. So a slide of a biopsy, for example, and so any given biopsy, there's several levels of magnification, but there's this huge amount of information. This is a true needle in a haystack problem that humans, it requires an incredible amount of concentration and work to really make these diagnoses. And when you look at some of the machine learning work that's come out of the pathology space, some of the insights that these models were picking up were not related to some of the things that pathologists were typically thinking about were indications of severe disease. In other words, as opposed to looking at the cell itself, it was looking at the spaces between the cells or the interaction between them, or on a macro scale. Again, as we talked about before, the big picture, how it's actually able to do things that really provided new insights into how we stage or understand it. So this is true irregardless. So again, if you've worked out that it's not a biased or spurious result or a spurious causation, and it's actually something that's a true insight, that stuff is really great. And again, I think that pathology, but certainly all across the different fields, you're looking at ophthalmology data sets that are predicting heart disease risk and things that we aren't already doing. Those are insights, I think, that are incredibly useful, and we can act on them, right? We know how to do preventative heart disease, or we know how to at least put those patients into screening and best practices for preventative care. That to me is really where some of these insights are actually great. And if you happen to do a project that you come across something and you can validate it, that's a ton of fun, right? Because now you're not only creating new medical knowledge, but you're also able to do something that could impact, again, sort of at a scaled approach, a lot of patients.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. And being a co-director, I wanted to. I know this. I mentioned before the meeting is how being a co-director who deals with experts from CS and medical imaging. How do you tend to be a bridge for between to the experts to communicate their work versus what are the things they can achieve versus what are the expectations? How do you try to merge? Because I kind of find those things challenging. I don't understand what medical experts really want out of it and versus what CS people can do. How do you try to merge, or are there any efforts that you put in from your end to make that communication smooth?
You're talking about communication with, are you talking about like just generally, or how we communicate findings?
Yeah, in general, like if there is some medical problem that you're working on, the initiation is like, I need to understand what is the end goal of what does that data mean versus how do I, like, for example, if I do image registration, that just deletes or at least max blackfies the data. That is very important from a medical standpoint. I should be knowing what is the concern and what is the important thing to you, right? All those kind of things, and versus versus what machine learning can do. Like there are certain limitations to the algorithms itself. Like how do you
Yeah,
try
well,
to
that's
merge?
a great question. We spend a lot of time thinking about how we can communicate the guidelines, right? Where it works, where it doesn't work, how it was trained, what subpopulations. So we have overall performance, and you can talk about subclass performance, right? And then that we hope it's sort of that data sheets for data sets idea that's kind of catching on, I think, more broadly. But just to say, we need to know a lot about how the model was trained and all the information. And then we don't just need to know one ROC curve. We need to know under several conditions how it performs. And then for us, what we try to do is we actually try to show a real world deployment and what that might look like as well. And then where we're finding that it underperforms, right? And that is critical communication. That again, we spend a lot of time on for clinical trials, for FDA validation, for IRB ethics approvals for trials or projects. These are sort of givens, right? We need to know that information, and we take a lot from the drug industry about how they've done this over time as well, because a lot of drugs are kind of black boxes as well, right? And so we didn't know where they work and where they don't. And as we're seeing with the vaccines, we're learning a lot about this in real time and in out in the open. But this is a standard practice in healthcare.
Right. And yeah, I know we are running out of time. I'd like to thank you for being over here. It was really insightful, and it was glad to have you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. It was great to chat with you, and you're doing great work out there. And again, I'm always happy to see another ASU alum, and maybe I hope to see you in person someday out there when I visit again. I love that area, love that campus, and like I said, congrats on all the great work.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll love to meet you too.
All right, well, take
See you.
care. Thanks again.
Bye bye.
Bye.